This is a time for kids worship, and it is an excellent opportunity for the kids to hear the gospel presented towards their age group. And as we continue on in the book of Zechariah, and here we'll be in Zechariah chapter 11, beginning in the 4th verse. Making our way rather quickly through the book of Zechariah, but nonetheless, I think this particular passage should really be something to take note of. And so, for us to be prepared to take note of what is most significant in the passage, I'm going to first pray to that end. And so, if you would join me in prayer. Lord, we are convinced and convicted that if we're left to our own devices, we will call things that are wise, that are actually foolish. But there are things to our minds at moments would seem foolish in and of themselves, in particular the cross. And we see from your word the Spirit illuminates those things and helps us to see the wisdom of it. Where we might have a blind spot or a hesitancy, your Spirit overcomes it by the instruction of your word. And so I pray for those very things over the next few moments, that your Spirit would prepare our hearts to receive the message we see in Zechariah chapter 11, a message that was costly in the end. And we ask these things in your Son's name. Amen. This is Zechariah chapter 11. We're going to begin in verse 4. If you will please stand as we read out of reverence for the reading of God's word. Zechariah chapter 11, verse 4. Thus said the Lord my God, become shepherd of the flock, doomed to slaughter. Those who buy them, slaughter them and go unpunished. And those who sell them, say, blessed be the Lord, I have become rich. And their own shepherds have no pity on them. For I will no longer have pity on the inhabitants of the land, declares the Lord. Behold, I will cause each of them to fall into the hand of his neighbor, and each into the hand of his king, and they shall crush the land, and I will deliver none from their hand. So I became the shepherd of the flock, doomed to be slaughtered by the sheep traders. And I took 2 staffs, one I named Favor, the other I named Union, and I tended the sheep. And 1 month I destroyed the 3 shepherds, but I became impatient with them, and they also detested me. So I said, I will not be your shepherd. What is to die, let it die. What is to be destroyed, let it be destroyed. And let those who are left devour the flesh of one another. And I took my staff, Favor, and I broke it, annulling the covenant that I had made with all the peoples. So it was annulled on that day, and the sheep traders who were watching me knew that it was the word of the Lord. And then I said to them, if it seems good to you, give me my wages, but if not, keep them. And they weighed out as my wages 30 pieces of silver. Then the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, the lordly price at which I was priced by them. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of the Lord to the potter. Then I broke my second staff, Union, annulling the brotherhood between Judah and Israel. Then the Lord said to me, take once more the equipment of a foolish shepherd, for behold, I am raising up the land a shepherd who does not care for those being destroyed, or seek the young, or heal the maimed, or nourish the healthy, but devours the flesh of the fat ones, tearing off even their hooves. Please be seated. This passage is a warning. There's numerous warning passages in Scripture. So you have to ask, what's the purpose of a warning? Because on the outset, we might say a warning isn't only for those who don't believe, that if you stay in your unbelief, there are consequences. The problem is the warning passages keep being preached to believers. So in what sense is a warning? What should be the outcome of a warning for us? I think it does two things. First, it really does remind us of very real consequences. Right? By the end of the passage, these sheep are going to be torn apart. However, for a believer, it should also have an additional effect. It should make us hyper vigilant, especially diligent to do the things that we're being called to do. Let me go a different route for just a moment. There's a warning group in our society, the people who at your workplace are in charge of safety. They come around with warnings all the time. I don't know if you've been in a workplace where their safety is a big issue. I worked construction very briefly in college, and it was constantly something where there was this guy who would come around, and you better not even pick up a saw without some eye protection, right? And he would come around. It's like he was hiding right behind the sheetrock, and he saw me go for the saw. No, sir. And you think, oh, you're killing me. So they would constantly be coming around. Where's your eye protection? Aren't you supposed to have your steel-toed, non-slip boots? Why didn't you bring them today? And you said, well, because I played golf before I came. And so there was always something. So then to really get your attention, they would host safety meetings. Have you ever been a part of a safety meeting? In a safety meeting, what they do is they scour the internet now. Before it was just news articles. They scour the internet looking for the most horrific accidents they can find. And they present them to you. You don't wear those safety goggles? You know what happened to the last guy who didn't wear his safety goggles? Ended up at a wood chipper. You think, oh man, I don't know how glasses got you to the wood chipper, but you think, man, that's awful. Did they really? And he says, yes. And you know what they always do to prove their point? They bring a slideshow. Better not do it before lunch. And they're just clicking through, right? This will be you. This will be you. And so there's all these warnings about you better do what you're supposed to do. If you don't do what you're supposed to do, there's going to be severe consequences. It was weird at the dentist office, right? That you don't wear eye protection, there's a wood chipper, but nonetheless, it's still true. No matter where you are in society, it's going to be consequences. The problem is twofold. One is the Bible has very severe warnings. And it's consistently saying you need to recognize the consequences, because the consequences should produce in you this vigilance to really live this thing out. I said, there's a problem though. When the safety guy at work comes around, nobody seems to appreciate him. If you work in that industry, you know this, right? Nobody appreciates the safety guy. He's constantly telling you, you can't stand on top of the ladder. You gotta, do these things. You shouldn't have that extension cord around your neck. I mean, he's just constantly trying to do things to save your life, but he's never appreciated. In the Bible, it's even worse. Historically, those who brought warnings to God's people were hated. They were hated consistently, over and over again. It was such a fact of life that Jesus, by the end of his ministry, can repeat consistently, you didn't listen to the prophets. They warned you, you didn't listen to them. So he comes with his own set of warnings. So if you think of Matthew, at the end of Matthew chapter 23, he gives a set of warnings. And they're woes. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. Woe to you, hypocrites. By the time you get down to verse 29, in particular, here's the warning in verse 29. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build tombs of the prophets and decorate the monuments of the righteous. So he says, you built tombs for the prophets, like you really honored their legacy. Here's what's interesting. The last guy to preach chapter 11 that we read is referenced here. Listen to Matthew 23. If you skip down to verse 35, he's warning these leaders in society, and here's what he says in verse 35. So that on you may come all the righteous bloodshed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Zechariah addresses the shepherds, the leaders. In particular, his warning comes in Zechariah chapter 11. Between the sanctuary and the altar gives the implication he walked out of the temple sanctuary, and before he could make it just past the front porch, they killed him. He preached, in particular, you would say, what passage of Zechariah addressed these people? It was Zechariah chapter 11 in particular. So this puts a little trepidation in my mind as I'm preparing this week. Last guy to preach this got killed before he got outside. So we're going to give it a shot. Wait, that was a bad segue. We're going to give it a chance. So here's where we are. 4 elements to this passage. They go kind of quickly, so I think we can pick up on it. It's kind of all one big symbol. But the symbol is broken down in these 4 parts. First, he says it's a group. The group he's preaching to is doomed already. Then he brings attention to the shepherd's staffs. There were 2 of them. Thirdly, he says, ultimately, it results in the rejection of the shepherd. So therefore, there are consequences, fourthly. So doomed, the staff, rejection, and consequences. So here's where he starts out. He says in verse 4, become shepherd of the flock, doomed to slaughter. What he's saying is, especially as you see in verse 7, they're already doomed to slaughter. So he's saying, come, I want you to shepherd these people. The way they're going, the way the sheep are headed right now, is ultimately to the slaughterhouse. So he says, I want you to come along and correct where they're going. This idea of doomed already, though, what we're going to find in just a moment is the shepherd directly points to Jesus. So would Jesus have had the same message? Well, Jesus had precisely the same message. John chapter 3, verses 17 and 18, he says between the 2 verses, God did not send his son into the world to condemn the world. He goes on to say the world is condemned already. People are doomed to slaughter. Jesus shows up on the scene to shepherd them away from it. So sheep, people, doomed to slaughter, condemned or doomed already, is a senseless act of violence. Let me point it out to you. It's rather technical for just a split second, just one word in particular. When he references the sheep, the flock, and then he goes on to make other references to it. Hebrew is written in a way that doesn't correspond directly with English. We have to use multiple words. Here, the word is for feminine sheep. They were going to slaughter the ewes, you might say. The feminine, feminine sheep. I don't know a better word. Ewes, I think is technical. So, why that's important? If you were raising sheep to be slaughtered, you would slaughter the males consistently. Throughout history, it was a pretty simple system. If you want lamb chops, you're into mint jelly. If you want lamb chops, then you slaughtered the males, but you would keep back some of your prize males to keep breeding. if you slaughter all the females, you're going to go out of business real quickly. What he's pointing to is at that point, it's just slaughtering for the sake of slaughtering. You want really for a tradesman, a sheep trader is the reference to. If they're selling females indiscriminately, just selling every sheep they can, they're doing it just to get a quick buck because they're going to put themselves out of business. It's just about kill as many sheep as fast as possible. So he is starting out. This is the group that's doomed to slaughter, and they're at the hands of people who are merciless fools. They don't care one bit about the sheep. They don't care about the longevity of the herd. They don't care about any of that. What would possess people to operate that way? Well, he tells us. He says they fundamentally miss the warning here because of a miscalculation. There's two of them in the passage, but here's the first one, the first miscalculation. It comes here in verse 5. It says, those who buy and slaughter them and go unpunished, and those who sell them, the traders, say, blessed be the Lord, I have become rich. So here's their thought. Their thought is, proof's in the pudding. Obviously, me being well off means God is pleased with what I'm doing. Me being well off, me being rich, you don't get rich if God doesn't like what you're doing. So yes, I'm selling off other people in my own flock in order to be slaughtered, but I'm making a buck as I exploit them. So clearly, my circumstances in life point to the legitimacy of what I'm doing before God. Let me try this again because we don't want to miss this miscalculation. The idea is that if God were trying to tell me he didn't like what I was doing, he would use my circumstances to do so. That's the idea. If I have bad circumstances, God must be displeased with me. If I have good circumstances, bless the Lord. I've gotten rich. He's saying you can't guide your life based on your circumstances. That's a miscalculation. So let me ask it differently. Do you currently believe the circumstances of your life are a good guide? Do you feel like when things are going well, God must be blessing you? And then I should just keep going. The negative is where I usually find people acknowledge it. Things are going bad. And our conclusion is, whatever I'm doing, God must dislike. We hit our knees in prayer and we think, God, I don't know what this is about. Obviously, you're trying to get my attention. Obviously, something's going wrong. Thought I was going to get a raise and they cut me by 20%. Clearly, God is displeased with me. If that's true, then what you're doing is we're making a calculation. Circumstances guide whether or not I'm faithfully following Jesus. That's the conclusion. I base it on my circumstances. If that were true, Jesus and his followers really missed it. Almost all of them are killed for following Jesus. They all had bad circumstances. So circumstances are a poor guide. Circumstances are no guide. Circumstances will lead you in the entirely wrong direction. So he says, don't make this miscalculation. It will cause you to do things that are senseless. It will cause you to destroy yourself. It'll cause you to have no longevity. But you'll do it in the meantime thinking, God's blessing me because we think circumstances are a good guide. Leaves you to ask, then what should be the guide? What should be the guide is a shepherd with a staff. So we get to our next item, the shepherd's staff. He brings this up. He comes back to verse 7. So I became the shepherd of the flock, doomed to slaughter. So he gets two staffs. So as you probably already know, well acquainted with, the staff was to guide the sheep. One staff is favor. It could also be translated as grace. It's the same synonyms. One staff is favor. The other is unity. Favor and unity. And so as the sheep get out of line, the staff has the function of pushing the sheep back in line. They were also stout enough that we know through historical references, even in the Bible, that you could defend the sheep against predators. So if some kind of predator, a wolf, a lion, I don't know, comes up, one of the things they could do with the staff was I could defend the sheep. So they pushed them in line, grace and unity. Kept the sheep going and at the same time could defend the sheep. So these two staffs are given to him. The idea behind favor or grace is really Jesus has provided for you. You are doomed to slaughter, and he is guiding you with grace away from slaughter. It's a pretty straightforward image. The beauty of that staff is it brings security, value, and identity. So if I am being guided by the grace of Jesus Christ, I now have a good guide in my life. The other staff that's pushing us back in line is unity. Unity, as we see in this passage, is in particular unity between the sheep. 1 John gives us a little more insight for Christians. He says in verse 3, that which we have seen and heard we proclaim also to you. We're eyewitnesses to this idea. That's what he's saying. So that you too may have fellowship with us. You might have unity, fellowship with each other. And indeed, our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. Here's what he's presenting for Christians. The Father and Son have unity with each other. The Trinity has perfect unity. That's granted to us. So we have unity with God. Since we have unity with God, we have unity with each other. We have a family that is the body of Christ. And he says that unity, coming together with a covenant body of believers, is a guide in your life. But here's where things go awry. We end up at the rejection of the shepherd. It's kind of hard to determine whether he gets fired or he quits. I had a job like that once. I worked at a restaurant in my late teens. Realized they were going to fire me for attending a football game. It was a major game. Tennessee was playing Florida. Had great seats. I mean, there's just so you got to draw the line somewhere, okay? And so I realized they're going to fire me. It came down to the suspension. So I did what he does, kind of in a sense. Right before they can fire me, you know what I do? You can't fire me. I quit. I'd already found another job that paid better. But in the moment, it felt very heroic. I know it was sinful. That's not the point. In the moment, it felt very heroic. I'm out of here. I quit. You can't fire me. You can keep your chips and salsa. And so, wish it weren't all true. So he says, in the passage, we get down, we continue on in his career. They did it for a month. Does it for a month. He gets rid of the 3 shepherds. And after he's gotten rid of these other shepherds, he is symbolizing the sole shepherd. Let me pause real quickly. Zechariah does not actually become the shepherd. This is symbolic. As you notice at the end, he's supposed to take up the symbols of a foolish shepherd. So he doesn't go from being a good shepherd to a foolish shepherd. It's a symbolic act. The prophets do it consistently. Back in chapter 6, he did a symbolic act with a crown, crowning somebody king. So this is symbolic, but it points forward ultimately to Christ. So he does it for this month. In verse 8, he said, "In 1 month I destroyed the 3 shepherds, but I became impatient with them, and they also detested me." So he quits, seemingly right before he gets fired. So the response that they detested him causes him ultimately to take one of the staffs, grace, and break it. Takes the staff, snaps it over his knee. And he says, the grace you were going to receive, that covenant of grace, has been annulled. You don't want anything to do with my grace in your life, then it will not render its benefit. He snaps that staff. Then he comes back to him after breaking that staff and quitting. And he says, listen, I love his words. He says, listen, I know I only worked here for a month, but you never gave me a paycheck. Pay me what you think I deserve, or don't pay me and keep it. I'm fine either way. So they come up with what he deserves in order to bring grace into their life. They come with a really specific amount that, Lord willing, will catch your attention. It's 30 pieces of silver. 30 pieces of silver is used throughout the Old Testament as a monetary amount that's considered insignificant. It's supposed to demonstrate complete insignificance. In other words, yeah, you worked here, you were bringing grace in our life, and you were bringing unity in our life, and we could care less. You want some pay? Fine. Here's 30 coins. The amount gets mocked, ultimately. God tells him what to do with the lordly price he was given. He says, I'll tell you what, go back up and throw it to the potter in the Lord's house, the potter in the temple. So he goes back up and he says, your second miscalculation was you did not value true guidance. You overvalued circumstantial guidance, and when it came to actual guidance, it held no value in your life at all. Here's why I say that should stand out to you. You remember the other spot of 30 pieces of silver somebody's paid? It comes in Matthew 26. It's a rather famous occasion. In verse 15, verse 14, for a little bit of context, the one of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priest and said, what will you give me if I deliver him over to you? And they paid him 30 pieces of silver. So then he begins to look for where he can betray Jesus. We get that occasion in chapter 27, verse 3 of 27. Just after the Lord's Supper we read a moment ago. It says, then when Judas, his betrayer, saw Jesus was condemned, because he'd given him up, betrayed him for 30 pieces of silver, he changed his mind and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders, saying, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. They said, what is that to us? See to it yourself. And throwing down the pieces of silver into the temple, he departed, and he went and hanged himself. But the chief priest, taking the pieces of silver, said, it is not lawful to put them into that treasury, since it is blood money. So they took counsel and bought with them the potter's field as a burial place for strangers. Therefore, that field has been called the field of blood to this day. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken by the prophet Jeremiah, saying, and they took 30 pieces of silver, the price of him on whom a price had been set by some of the sons of Israel, and they gave them for the potter's field as the Lord directed me. Jesus was evaluated as being worth 30 pieces of silver. Judas carries out the same act as we saw in Zechariah, that the coins were thrown back into the temple. There's a unique difference. Here it attributes that saying to Jeremiah. You may have noticed. Jeremiah is the one who adds that the money would actually go to into the temple to buy a potter's field. He said the potsherd gate field. So it combines two prophecies. Here's why the field is significant. Really, it's a doubling down. It's a doubling down saying, Jesus is worthless. He's worth 30 pieces of silver. Judas had a moment in which he thought, I have messed up. So he comes back and he says, listen, this 30 pieces of silver was for blood money for an innocent man. You considered it worthless, but in the end, this is a dirty thing. What do they do with that money? They go out and buy a field. Here's the interesting thing about potter's field. It was considered a worthless field because they would make a lot of vases and different pottery dishes. Well, as Eugene Merrill points out, an expert on Zechariah, that potters would often set up shop right by either a dump or a worthless field because they would consistently break so many pieces in the firing process and the entire making process. They would have lots of shards of clay and nothing to do with them, so they would throw them into this field. Have you ever broken glass outside and tried to get it out of your yard? Digging out all the little glass shards is almost impossible. So you think, well, remember, don't step there. So now you have a whole field of shards. It's worthless. So what they do is they take the 30 pieces of silver, instead of rethinking, hey, maybe we should have valued Jesus. They said, nope, this is worth buying a field full of shards and let's make it a burial place for the strangers nobody wants to claim. They double down on how worthless they see Jesus to be. Well, back in Zechariah, when that happens, the money's cast into the temple, it's exposed as they could care less about the shepherd. He breaks his second staff of unity. He says they think being united together holds absolutely no value. That Jesus would provide unity for us is worthless. Here's where I think this warning gets you in trouble, or at least if you're the messenger, perhaps. Right now, in U.S. society, there's a phenomena going on. It was heightened through COVID. Maybe if I could show you a quick contrast. Two older gentlemen told me a story that really struck me. They had almost identical stories. The day they got married for both of them was a Saturday. They left to go on a honeymoon. So in the, I suspect, 40s, 50s range, honeymoons a lot of times didn't mean you went and caught a plane. A lot of times it meant you just drove to a beach or somewhere else. Both of them, Sunday morning, got up and they began to make their journey to two different destinations. One in particular I remember was Florida. You know what they did on the way to their honeymoon? The morning after their wedding? They found a church to go to. Both of them. They searched around the town that they were in until they found a Baptist church and made sure they went to church on that Sunday morning. Because they thought, you don't miss church. You might do a lot of things on your honeymoon, but you don't miss church. That was a generational thing that I would suggest to you has probably been lost. Somebody is going to surprise me after the service. We went to church. And so, that's great. I would suggest for most, it's been lost. Here's why I would suggest it's been lost. If memory serves, it was the former CEO of Lifeway, a group that puts out Christian material. They conduct a lot of surveys. They were trying to figure out how often do evangelicals go to church. Well, they have done the same poll year after year after year for a few decades. What the guy was saying, though, is they had to change the parameters of what faithful church attendance meant. He said when they started conducting the poll, they would ask this question: do you go to church on average 1 to 3 times a week? On average, do you go 1 to 3 times a week? They considered a faithful church member as somebody who answered yes to that question. You know how they phrased it now? Do you show up in church 1 to 3 times a month? That's a faithful church member. This passage, if it's right, is saying that shift, no matter how often you should show up, that shift shows us we don't care about being united with other believers like they once did. It'd be hard to argue with. We don't value that guidance from the shepherd in our life like we once did. If the passage is right, it's saying those who don't value unity are the same people that paid off Judas. And then when it was brought to their attention, they said, I'd rather have a yard full of glass shards than that in my life. It's a tough message. Grace and unity, you would think, what a beautiful thing. When they start to guide life, though, I want to push against that staff. What he says is, push against the staff, and eventually you'll find it completely worthless. You'll get to the place where I would rather have about anything else. When you've gotten there, he says the consequences set in. They were listed out in verse 16. Zechariah truly preached that message from God and was murdered. People hate that message. But he says what your life is dependent upon is being actually guided by the shepherd. He's going to bring grace into your life, and you were doomed to slaughter, and he's going to forgive so that your now new life forward no longer revolves around destruction. But you've got to embrace the other staff as well. He says, I've purposely brought unity, brought you two together. And there does come a breaking point in which he says, listen, you push back and you push back and you push back, fine. Let what will live, live. Let what will die, die. You might rephrase it. At some point, the shepherd quits. You push back and you push back and you push back and you push back. I'm going to let you go. I'm breaking this staff. So I think, while it might be unpopular, at least for the past couple thousand years since Zechariah preached it, a warning should produce an understanding of the consequences and a sense of vigilance. I need that shepherd in what he guides me with. My hope is that we would at least say that message is certainly there. Zechariah was forceful about it. A few hundred years later, it comes up with Jesus in his own life being betrayed. I think it's a valuable message. Would you please stand as we sing this final song?